The strange thing about depositions is the silence. You sit at a polished mahogany table that reflects the fluorescent lights overhead, and you listen to the echoes of your own life. When her lawyer finally asked about the watch, a ridiculous Audemars Piguet, I saw it not on Julian's wrist, but sitting in a clear plastic evidence bag on the table between us. It looked smaller there, stripped of its power. But that moment came much later. The story of why we were in that airless room began 6 months earlier, on the quiet Saturday morning of my 42nd birthday. The kitchen was bright with sun. I stood at the stove, focused on the 2 eggs in the pan. They had to be perfect, symmetrical, a small, silent victory. The coffee maker gurgled, its rhythm the only sound in the house. I used a small spatula to nudge a stray bit of egg white back into place. Control. Isabella swept in. She wore a Lululemon outfit that probably cost more than my first car. Her eyes were fixed on the screen of her phone. She kissed the air an inch from my cheek, the scent of her perfume, Baccarat Rouge 540, hanging in the space between us. "Happy birthday, darling," she said, still scrolling. "Don't fill up too much. Julian is bringing that ridiculously expensive Dom Perignon you don't care about." She opened the Sub-Zero refrigerator, its stainless steel door gleaming. Her nose wrinkled. "Did you buy the generic Whole Foods brand of almond milk again?" The tone was light, teasing, a joke between us. Except it wasn't. It's just watery. I looked at her. A smile touched my lips, but died before it could reach my eyes. "It was on sale," I said. The party started a few hours later. I moved through the rooms of my own house like a ghost, a caterer in the wrong clothes. I handed a guest a drink, and my eyes caught the watch on Julian Croft's wrist. An Audemars Piguet. A gift from Isabella for closing the Ridgeline deal. I did the math in my head. The commission, the price of the watch. The numbers didn't add up. I didn't know it then, but that watch would become Exhibit A in the fraud case. Later, I opened my presents. Isabella handed me a beautifully wrapped box. Inside was a cashmere sweater, almost identical to the worn one I had on. "Now you have two," she exclaimed, her smile bright and wide for the assembled guests. I ran my fingers over the fabric. It was fine, expensive, an audit of the material. I held it up. In the reflection in the window behind me, I could see her across the room, laughing with Julian. I would see that same reflected image of them, months later, on the polished surface of a conference table as her world came undone. I needed air. I didn't storm off. I drifted away, out onto the stone patio. The manicured backyard was dark. I noticed the landscape light was crooked, and I bent down to adjust it. A small, meticulous act of control. And from that spot, cloaked in shadows, I heard their voices carry from the brightly lit living room. "Is he having fun?" one of her friends asked. "He looks intense." Isabella let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It was louder and more real than any sound she had made in my direction all day. "Elias? Intense. The most intense thing he does is balance the checkbook. Thank God for Julian's business sense. Elias's paltry paycheck barely covers the property taxes." I made her repeat those exact words, under oath, in a room with no champagne and no laughter. Julian smirked. I saw his hand go to the small of her back. "Possessive. He's a good provider," he said, the words dripping with condescension. "Stable. Safe." The final cut came from the other friend. She leaned in, her voice a conspiratorial whisper that sliced through the night. "At least he's too dull to ever ask where the real money comes from." Isabella's laughter was the loudest. It was a confirmation. The noise of the party faded into a low, distant hum. The only sound was my own breathing. Steady, even. I didn't feel rage. I felt a profound and chilling stillness. My mind filed the information away. The casual cruelty. The complete disrespect. Long after the last guest had gone, the house was silent. Isabella was asleep, breathing softly in our bed. I stood in the walk-in closet. On her side, a canyon of wealth. Chanel handbags and Christian Louboutin shoes. I reached out and touched the sleeve of a silk blouse. The fabric was cool against my fingertips. My side of the closet was a neat, orderly row of sensible suits and plain sweaters. I gently touched the new cashmere sweater she had given me. It felt identical to the old one. For a moment, my control cracked. My shoulders slumped. I rested my forehead against the cool, dark wood of the divider. The raw, human pain of it all washed over me. The husband she thought was a human calculator was just a man, and he knew his marriage was a lie. I walked into the master bathroom and looked at my reflection in the ornate mirror. I saw the hurt man, the fool in the sweater. Then, something shifted. I straightened my posture. My eyes, which had been filled with a quiet sorrow, became clear, focused. I smoothed my hair, a simple, automatic gesture. The hurt hardened into something else. It cooled, solidified, into a terrifying resolve. The man she thought she knew died in that moment. In his place, something else was taking notes. In the dead of night, I sat in my small home office. The only light was the cold, blue glow from my monitor. On the screen was a single PDF, an offshore account statement from a bank in the Caymans. I had seen the file before, weeks ago, and ignored it as a stray client document she'd saved to the wrong network drive. But now it had context. My hand moved to the mouse. The click was deafening in the silence. I opened a new, encrypted spreadsheet. A blinking cursor awaited a title. I typed 2 words, Vance, Isabella. It would become the master file, the digital root of an evidence tree with 100 poison branches. I leaned back, my face illuminated by the screen. A predator who had just caught the scent of his prey. The hunt had begun. The sun was bright in our bedroom the next morning. It streamed in, catching the dust motes dancing in the air and illuminating the serene, sleeping face of my wife. She looked beautiful, innocent, a masterpiece of deception. I was already dressed for work, gray suit, white shirt, muted tie, sitting perfectly still on the edge of the bed. I reached over and gently pulled the duvet over her exposed shoulder. It was a husband's gesture, an echo from a life that had ended 12 hours earlier. But my mind was cold, observational. I was studying a specimen. My gaze moved from her to the expensive art on the walls, the designer furniture from Roche-Beaubois, the silk curtains. I saw them all for the first time, not as our possessions, but as exhibits. Evidence. I stood, straightened my tie in the mirror, and walked out of the room without a sound. My first stop was our local Chase branch, a place where I was just another quiet customer. I approached Maria, a friendly teller I'd made small talk with for years. I gave her a practiced smile, one of mild confusion. My wife and I are consolidating our statements for a mortgage review. I began, my voice pitched with just the right amount of helplessness. There's a recurring transfer from an old joint savings I can't seem to place. Isabella is hopeless with these things. Maria would later testify that I seemed worried and a little lost. She was half right. She tapped at her keyboard and, a minute later, slid a printed slip across the counter. It held the original routing and account numbers for the offshore shell, the keys to the henhouse. Next, human intelligence. One of Isabella's friends, the one who made the joke about the source of the money, had a public Instagram. She checked in at the same Blue Bottle coffee every morning. I was there waiting, hidden behind the Wall Street Journal. When she came in, I stood and accidentally bumped into her, spilling a little of my coffee. Amid the apologies and pleasantries, I slipped the needle in. Isabella has been so busy with that new venture of Julian's, I said offhandedly. Some new import-export thing, right? She's so vague about it. I watched her face. I saw the micro-expression, a flicker of panic in her eyes before she smiled it away. It was the same look she'd have when her own name was read on the indictment. The last stop of the day was the dry cleaner. As the attendant handed me a bundle of Isabella's dresses, wrapped in plastic, I noticed a receipt tucked into the pocket of a cocktail dress. I pulled it out, feigning puzzlement. It was from a restaurant, Spago, in Beverly Hills. That's funny, I said, mostly to myself. I didn't think we were in town that week. I pocketed it. That simple piece of thermal paper, smelling faintly of chemical cleaners, would corroborate the hotel booking records perfectly. That night, the dinner table was a war room. Isabella chattered about a charity gala she was planning. The costs were obscene. I used to just nod along. Now I listened. The centerpieces alone are $5,000, she said with a light laugh, expecting my usual quiet disapproval. I put down my fork and looked at her. From where? She was taken aback. What? The florist, I said calmly. What's the name of the vendor? Oh, she fumbled. Fleurs de Luxe or something. Julian's people recommended them. And the caterers? I pressed, my tone even. Are you using the same LLC that handled the fundraiser last fall? Artisanal Events Group. A flash of pure fear crossed her face before she buried it under a wave of irritation. Elias, what is this? An audit? Since when do you care about the details? I've always cared about the details, I replied, holding her gaze. I'm just starting to ask about the right ones. I picked up my fork and continued eating. The silence that followed was heavy with everything she wasn't saying. Later, in my office, I hit a wall, a dead end in a chain of transactions. Frustrated, I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a small, worn photo album. I flipped past the glossy, staged pictures of our wedding, of us on vacations we couldn't afford. I stopped at a faded photograph from the beginning. We were on a park bench in the city, sharing a hot dog from a street cart. We were laughing. The joy was real, unforced. I traced the outline of her younger, smiling face with my finger. A deep, profound sadness washed over the cold resolve. A moment of grief for the man I was, and for the love I thought we had. Then I went back to work. I spent hours cross-referencing the data I had gathered. Bank transfers, vendor names, shell corporations. And then I found it. An incorporation document, filed digitally, for a company called J&I Holdings. A ghost company. On paper, it barely existed. But the money inside it was real. My money. I saw two signatures at the bottom. Julian Crofts was an arrogant scrawl. The other was Isabella Vance. When the forensic accountant projected her signature onto the courtroom screen months later, next to the one on this document, I heard a sharp intake of breath from the jury box. The looping, elegant I and V were identical to the ones she used to sign my birthday cards every year. A confession in calligraphy. I had them. Energized, I dug deeper into J&I Holdings. I mapped its transactions, a spiderweb of deceit. I found a series of regular, high-value payments flowing out to a single, personal account. It wasn't Isabella's. I ran the account holder's name. Annalise Schmidt. A quick search pulled up a photo. A young, stunning art gallery curator. I navigated to Julian Croft's social media. There, in the background of a photo from a recent gallery opening, I saw her. Annalise. She was looking at Julian. It wasn't the look of a business partner. It was the unmistakable gaze of a lover. I stared at the screen. The equation had changed. Isabella, the architect of my humiliation, wasn't just Julian's partner in crime. She was his fool, just as I had been hers. My wife, the great deceiver, was also being deceived. This was no longer just about justice. It was about control. The afternoon sun was bright in the backyard. Isabella was directing a team of landscapers, pointing out an imaginary imperfection in a boxwood hedge with a flick of her wrist. She was debating the precise shade of hydrangeas for an upcoming party. The picture of domestic perfection. I watched her from the kitchen window. In my hand, I held a steaming kettle. On the counter lay the mail I had just intercepted. A crisp, white envelope from a company I didn't recognize, addressed to her. I held the sealed flap over the rising steam, my movement steady. I slid a thin steel letter opener beneath the softened glue. Outside, she was curating a beautiful life. Inside, I was performing a quiet autopsy on the lie that paid for it. To understand the money, I needed expertise. I went to a place of hushed whispers and analog records, a forgotten corner of a university library that smelled of decaying paper. There I met a professor, an old journalist who had been professionally exiled years ago for getting too close to a powerful corporation. I didn't give him my name. I simply handed him a piece of paper with a list of transaction codes and holding company names. I asked him, if you were to see a pattern like this, where would you have looked for the source 20 years ago? He put on his spectacles and studied the paper. His eyes, though old, were sharp. He looked up at me, then pointed a crooked finger to a region on the large world map hanging on his wall. A place of dust and chaos. I would have looked for a war, he said. The letter I'd steamed open contained an address, the listed headquarters for Apex Global Imports. It was one of their major shell corporations. I drove there. The GPS didn't lead me to a glass tower in the city. It led me to a rundown strip mall in an industrial park, wedged between a coin-op laundromat and a boarded-up nail salon. A bored-looking clerk sat behind a plexiglass barrier inside a small, dusty office that was nothing but a wall of mailboxes. Millions of dollars were being washed through this shabby, anonymous room. This clerk, with his vacant eyes, would later sit in a witness box and testify that he never saw anything suspicious. He wasn't lying. Evil is often banal. That night, in my dark office, I traced the digital ghost of a single shipping container. On my monitor, a glowing line snaked its way from a port in the war-torn country the journalist had indicated, through a series of transfers, and finally to a holding facility owned by one of Julian's companies. The container's manifest, filed electronically, listed its contents with a single phrase: agricultural equipment. I knew, with a certainty that made me physically sick, that it was a lie. A few nights later, they hosted a dinner. A success was being celebrated. Julian, overflowing with champagne and charisma, raised his glass. To bold ventures, he said, looking straight at Isabella. And even bolder partners. She smiled, basking in his praise. I picked up my water glass. The small movement drew their attention. To transparency, I said. My voice was calm, but it cut through the chatter. It's so important that everyone knows exactly what they're investing in. The specific product. Julian's smile tightened. It's a complex portfolio, Elias. A bit dry for dinner conversation. I'm sure, I replied, my eyes locked on Isabella. It must be difficult to keep track of all the moving parts. All the shipments. Ensuring nothing spoils. The word hung in the air between us. Her hand trembled as she lifted her glass. The others at the table heard nothing. But she and Julian heard a declaration of war. I couldn't sleep. The house was dark and silent. I walked into the living room and my eyes fell on the large, silver-framed photograph on the mantelpiece. Our wedding day. We looked happy, hopeful. I picked it up. The frame was heavy in my hand. I stared at the smiling face of the woman I had married, a stranger who slept in my bed. A chasm had opened between that memory and this reality. My hand tightened on the silver. A sharp crack echoed in the silent room as the glass fractured, a spiderweb of cracks spreading across Isabella's smiling face. I didn't flinch. I just looked at the shattered image, a perfect summary of my life. I carefully placed the broken frame back on the mantelpiece. I left the damage visible. The old journalist sent me an encrypted file. The note attached was short. The pattern is old. The cargo is new. I opened it. It wasn't a spreadsheet. It was an intelligence report from an international aid organization. It was filled with grainy, horrific photographs. The agricultural equipment was a lie that covered illegal arms trafficking. They were selling weapons in a war zone. But there was something worse. One of the shell companies, an entity I had definitively linked to Isabella's looping signature, was used to finance a human trafficking ring. It preyed on the refugees created by the very conflict they were arming. I scrolled past the numbers and the codes to a low-resolution photo of a young girl. She was no older than 10. She stared blankly at the camera from inside a refugee camp. The report detailed how she and others were acquired. The hope I had felt, the spark of righteousness, was extinguished. It was replaced by a wave of nausea and a cold fury that burned deeper than grief. The numbers on my screen now had faces. The door to my office opened. Isabella walked in, wearing a silk nightgown that probably cost more than that girl's family had earned in a year. She was beautiful, and she was unaware. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly. She came and stood behind my chair, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You've been so distant lately. Whatever is going on at your little firm, you should leave it at the office." I didn't turn. I didn't move. I stared at the screen. The image of the refugee girl was reflected in my unblinking eyes. I could feel the gentle, proprietary touch of my wife's hand, the hand of a woman whose comfort was built on the suffering of that child. She was a monster, and she was touching me. I didn't answer her. I didn't even breathe. It was a Saturday morning. I was in the garage, cleaning my tools. Each wrench was polished until the chrome gleamed under the fluorescent light, then placed in its exact, size-ordered slot on the pegboard. The work was quiet, meditative. It was an act of imposing order on a world of chaos. Isabella came in from the kitchen, dressed in tennis whites. She saw me and scoffed, a small, airy sound of disapproval. "Honestly, Elias, I don't know why you bother. If something breaks, we call someone." I didn't look up from the screwdriver I was wiping down. "I like knowing how things work," I said. "And I like knowing exactly where to find the right tool when I need it." I wasn't talking about tools. In my office, I chose my weapon. It wasn't enough to leak the information. It had to be deployed with precision. I bypassed the big names at the major papers. They were too cautious, too beholden to advertisers. I settled on a journalist named Sarah Jenkins. Her career at a major financial journal had been destroyed years ago when she tried to expose a corrupt corporation, and they had buried her in lawsuits and public ridicule. Now she wrote for an aggressive, online-only news outlet. I saw her not as damaged goods, but as a hungry, overlooked asset with a deep-seated grudge against corporate bullies. She was the perfect instrument. I drove to a 24-hour laundromat in a part of the city I never visit, the air thick with the smell of bleach and damp heat. I fed cash into a pay-as-you-go computer terminal. I created a new, anonymous email address. The message I composed was brief and clinical. It contained no narrative, no accusation. Just a single, verifiable piece of data. The registration number for an offshore shell corporation, Nautilus Holdings, and a corresponding import manifest number for a shipment of telecommunications equipment from a Belgian arms manufacturer. I attached the document. I hit send. Then I wiped the machine clean and walked out into the night, just another shadow in the city. Days later, I was eating a sandwich from a paper bag on my lunch break, standing in a busy public square. I pulled out my phone and checked a stock market app. I found the parent company of one of Julian's largest legitimate holdings. The SEC had announced a review. The stock price, usually stable, was trembling. A slight, almost imperceptible smile touched my lips. I crumpled the bag and tossed it in the trash. The first stone had hit the water. That night was our scheduled date night. We were at a high-end restaurant where the clink of silverware was a carefully curated sound. Isabella was on edge. She kept checking her phone under the table. Is something wrong? I asked, calmly unfolding my linen napkin. No, nothing. Just a work thing, she lied, her voice a little too high. Julian is overreacting about a minor market fluctuation. Fluctuation? I feigned mild interest. Oh, you mean Croft Ventures? I saw that. Looked like more than a fluctuation. Looked like a C-suite executive just had his favorite yacht repossessed. I said it with the detached air of someone commenting on the rain. Her fork clattered onto her plate. Her mask shattered. What would you know about it? She hissed. You spend your days counting paper clips. I count numbers, I corrected her gently. And the numbers I saw today told a very interesting story. I met her panicked, furious gaze with a look of serene calm. She was powerless, and for the first time, she had no idea why. Back in my office, I pulled up Sarah Jenkins's professional bio. I read about her spectacular rise and her even more spectacular fall. I found a picture of her from that time, her face exhausted and defeated after a court appearance. I felt a quiet kinship. She was another person who had been underestimated, cast aside by the arrogant and the powerful. My decision to use her wasn't just strategic. It was an act of restoration. The next day, the symphony of panic began. I remember watching a financial news program on a television in a sterile office lobby. Sarah Jenkins was on, her voice filled with a confidence I recognized as vindication. My sources indicate that the shell corporation Nautilus Holdings is merely the tip of a very dirty iceberg for Croft Ventures. I pictured Julian in his glass-walled office. I could see him hurling a heavy crystal tumbler against the wall, the sound of it shattering lost in his roar of fury as he watched his company's stock ticker cascade in a waterfall of red. Millions of dollars, evaporating into thin air. I could almost hear Isabella, pulled over on the side of the road, her voice a panicked, pleading whine into her phone. What do you mean you can't stop it? Who could possibly know about Nautilus? Fix it, Julian. And I was in my study at home. I had headphones on, my eyes closed, listening to the controlled, mathematical beauty of a Bach cello suite. I was the calm at the center of the hurricane I had created. The giants were bleeding. But giants don't bleed out quietly. That night, from the ghost network I'd built to monitor their communications, I watched a recording of a video call. Julian was in his office. The rage was gone, replaced by a chilling, predatory focus. He was speaking to his severe-looking head of security. The leak was an external tip, the man reported. Untraceable. Julian's eyes were cold. An enemy we can't see is an enemy everywhere. I need to send a message. That reporter mentioned a source. The SEC is sniffing around our junior analysts. Find the most ambitious one, the one who looks guiltiest. He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. Ruin him. Publicly. I want everyone in this company to understand what happens when you even think about betraying me. He ended the call. The victory I had felt curdled in my gut. I had won the battle. But in doing so, I had awakened a monster who would happily sacrifice an innocent man to protect his kingdom. Blood was about to be spilled, and it was going to be on my hands. The quiet of that Sunday morning was a lie. Sunlight streamed into the living room, catching the dust in the air, creating an illusion of peace. Isabella stood with her back to me, her voice on the phone light and relieved. "No, it's fine now. Julian handled it. Just a market scare." A pause, then a musical laugh. "He always does." She hung up and turned, her smile confident. "Everything's back to normal," she said. It was both a reassurance and a warning. "Julian says their new cybersecurity is state-of-the-art. No one will ever get close to them again." She looked at me, expecting a response. I just nodded, turning a page of the newspaper. She didn't see my hand, the one holding my coffee cup. My knuckles were white from the pressure. Back in my office, my sanctuary, I tried to retrace my steps. I wanted to see what else their panic might have exposed. But the digital pathways I had ghosted through were gone. In their place was a fortress. I hit a wall, not a simple password field, but a multi-layered security protocol that seemed to stare back at me. Red error messages flashed across my screen. Then, a single line of text: "System intrusion detected." IP logged. Panic, cold and sharp, jolted through me. I ripped the Ethernet cable from the side of my laptop. The digital logs it kept of my failed attempt would later become a key part of my own initial indictment. Before the charges were dropped, the hunter was now the hunted. A corrosive guilt began to eat at me. I turned my forensic skills on a new target: Daniel Porter, the junior associate they had sacrificed. I wasn't looking for crimes. I was looking for a life. I found his LinkedIn profile. Bright, ambitious posts about the pride he felt joining Croft Ventures. I found his wife's Instagram. Photos of their toddler smearing birthday cake on his face. A recent post, full of joy, about putting an offer on their first house. Those happy family photos would eventually be entered as Exhibit C in Daniel's wrongful termination lawsuit, a case he was only able to afford because of a seven-figure anonymous donation to his legal defense fund. But on that day, as I scrolled, I just felt the weight of the life I had broken. I had another piece of the puzzle ready, another shell corporation. I went through the motions, composing a new, sterile email to Sarah Jenkins. The cursor blinked at the end of the message, a steady, rhythmic pulse. My finger hovered over the trackpad, over the send button. On my other monitor, a picture of Daniel Porter's smiling child stared back at me. I couldn't click. The righteous fury was gone, replaced by the sour taste of fear. I closed the laptop. At a charity auction that weekend, surrounded by the glittering, oblivious rich, I felt a hand clap my shoulder. It was Julian. His smile was a predatory slash in his handsome face. "Elias, glad you could make it," he said, his voice a low purr. "Things have been exciting at the office lately." He leaned in, his voice dropping, the smell of expensive scotch on his breath. "We had to do some house cleaning. Trim the fat. It's amazing what you find when you look closely. A little ambition in the wrong place. It's like a cancer. You have to cut it out. Violently." He took a sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving my face. "It's a lesson for everyone. Don't get involved in business you don't understand." A flash of teeth. "You stick to your numbers, Elias. It's safer." He clapped my shoulder again, a gesture of absolute dominance, and melted back into the crowd. He left me standing frozen, the threat hanging in the air like poison. I found Daniel Porter's new house. I parked down the street and just watched. A moving truck was parked at the curb. I saw his wife carry a cardboard box to the truck, her face streaked with tears. In the backyard, Daniel was methodically disassembling a small, brightly colored swing set. His shoulders were slumped. He moved like a man in a trance, all the life and ambition drained out of him. I just sat there in my car, a ghost at the funeral of a life I had destroyed, a silent, gut-wrenching vigil for my own morality. A few days later, I was in a sports bar, trying to get lost in the noise. A local news report came on the TV above the bar. The anchor stood in front of the Croft Ventures building. "Tonight, a promising career in flames," he said. The screen cut to a shot of Daniel Porter, hounded by reporters, carrying a small box of his belongings out of the building. He looked pale, terrified. "Daniel Porter was fired today amidst an ongoing SEC inquiry," the anchor continued. CEO Julian Croft cited a total breach of fiduciary duty and criminal negligence. The camera zoomed in on Daniel's face, a mask of pure, uncomprehending despair. He tried to speak. I didn't. The words were swallowed by the scrum. I looked down at my hands on the polished wood of the bar. They felt unclean. My office was my last refuge, and now it was a wreck. Discarded papers, empty coffee cups. My meticulous order was gone, replaced by chaos. I was defeated. I opened the master file on my computer, the complete, intricate map of their entire criminal enterprise. All my work. All the proof. My cursor hovered over the icon. I was going to delete it. End it. The moral cost was too high. I closed my eyes, my finger poised to click. The screensaver timed out, and the monitor went black. In the dark, reflective surface, I saw my own face. Haggard. Haunted. But in that instant, I saw more than just my own reflection. I saw Julian Croft's. I saw another man willing to destroy innocent lives to get what he wanted. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I recoiled from the screen, from the monster I saw there. I was staring into the abyss, and the face staring back at me was my own. My study was no longer a landscape of despair. It was a command center. I had restored order. On my monitor, I was playing chess against a grandmaster-level program. The computer, a creature of pure logic, suggested a direct, brutish attack on my king. It calculated an 82% probability of success. I ignored it. Instead, I made a quiet move, sliding a bishop into a seemingly useless position. A sacrifice. The computer's analysis flashed red, blunder. Probability of win, 18%. Isabella walked past the open doorway. "Still playing with your toys?" she asked. Her condescending smirk was a familiar weapon. "Don't you ever get tired of losing?" I didn't look up from the screen. "It's not about winning," I said calmly. "It's about creating a board where the other player has no good moves left." I made my next move, advancing a lowly pawn. The computer's analysis whirred, its logic circuits scrambling to reassess the new, impossible geometry of the board. Then, a new message appeared in stark, white text. "Checkmate in 3 moves." I had laid a trap its linear thinking couldn't see. I looked up, my eyes clear. I had my strategy. The first move was a gift. I knew Isabella and Julian used a high-security travel agent on the Upper East Side. I sent a lavish gift basket to their office from a grateful client. Tucked between a bottle of Veuve Clicquot and a box of Godiva chocolates was a sleek, digital picture frame. When questioned by federal investigators months later, the terrified receptionist would recall plugging it in because it looked so expensive. She had no idea that as it cycled through pleasant images of beaches and mountains, it was silently scanning her office Wi-Fi, hunting for a single file, Isabella's travel itinerary. Once I had passive access, I didn't steal. I planted a seed of poison. I intercepted the booking confirmation for their upcoming trip to the Caymans. With surgical precision, I altered the document. I added a single line item, private wealth consultation, Helvetia AG. I then forged a perfect wire transfer confirmation, showing a 7-figure sum moving from one of their primary shell accounts to a new, encrypted sub-account at that same notoriously shady bank. The transaction note was simple, per IV's private instruction. That single forged document would become the linchpin of Julian's entire conspiracy case against her. But Julian was paranoid. He would suspect a digital plant. I needed the idea to come to him from a human source. I used a burner phone and a voice modulator to call the art gallery owned by his mistress, Annalise. Posing as a client, my modulated voice was calm. "I just wanted to warn you," I said. I overheard Julian Croft's wife talking about her exit strategy. Something about setting up her own nest egg in the Caymans. "Be careful who you trust." I offered no proof. I just lit the fuse of her jealousy and let it burn. At a lavish dinner a week later, the poison was in their bloodstream. Julian stood to give a toast, his voice smooth and confident. "To partnership," he began, his eyes sweeping the table before locking on Isabella. "The kind built on absolute trust, where both parties know everything about the other's movements. No secret accounts. No private plans." His words were for the room. His eyes were daggers for her. Because the moment one partner starts thinking they're smarter than the other, the whole enterprise rots from the inside out. Isabella held his gaze, her smile a brittle, painted thing. She raised her glass. "To trust," she echoed, her voice a fraction too tight. The room applauded the performance. But for them, it was an interrogation. Before I set the final pieces in motion, I had a debt to pay. I met Sarah Jenkins in a cheap, all-night diner that smelled of stale coffee and regret. She didn't know my name. I was just a ghost in her inbox. "I don't understand," she said. "You give me the story of a lifetime, and you won't take anything. What do you want?" I slid a plain manila envelope across the sticky table. "This is everything you need to exonerate Daniel Porter. Internal memos, timestamped server logs. The proof Julian Croft framed him." I pushed a second, thicker envelope toward her. "And this is a cashier's check for him and his family. From an anonymous donor." "Why?" she asked, her expression a mix of suspicion and bewilderment. I looked down into my black coffee. I saw the image of a small, brightly colored swing set being taken apart. "I broke something," I said. "This won't fix it, but it's a start." I stood up and walked out, leaving her staring at the envelopes that would give one man his life back and another a small piece of his soul. Then came the implosion. Julian's security chief showed him the wire transfer I had forged. "It came from inside our network, sir," the man said, routed to look like it came from her laptop. "It's clean. Very clean." Julian's face was a mask of thunderous rage. Annalise played her part perfectly. "I'm just telling you what I heard, Julian," she cried. "She feels like she's done all the work, and you're taking all the credit." I watched on my own monitors as Isabella tore through her walk-in closet, her movements frantic. She threw aside boxes of designer shoes and pulled open a safe hidden in the wall. It was empty. Her gasp was silent on my audio feed, but I felt it. Julian had already been there. He had taken the emergency passports and the bearer bonds. The final move was a phone call. I listened as Julian's voice, dripping with venom, cut her down. "Your private accounts are frozen. Your credit cards are flagged. You have nothing without me. You want to be smart? Let's see how smart you are now." Their empire was eating itself alive. Isabella, terrified and defeated, used her last cash to take a taxi home. She walked into the dark, silent house. "My house. Elias?" she called out. There was no answer. I was long gone. She stepped into the living room. A floor lamp clicked on, flooding a small circle of the room in light. Julian was sitting in an armchair, a glass of scotch in his hand. He had been waiting. The calm on his face was more terrifying than any rage. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice soft, menacing. He took a slow sip. "We have a partnership to dissolve. And I promise you, the severance package is a killer." That final morning, the world was beautiful and still. I was in the garden, pruning the white roses, the snip of the shears a clean, satisfying sound in the quiet air. I moved with a calm, unhurried purpose, cultivating order. The house behind me was silent. She had not come home. This quiet garden was the eye of the hurricane, and landfall was imminent. My first stop was a nondescript parking lot overlooking the city. I took out a cheap, prepaid burner phone. I dialed the direct tip line for the FBI's white-collar crime division, a number I knew by heart. My voice, when I spoke, was not my own. It was digitally altered, nervous and thin. "I have information on Julian Croft and Isabella Vance," I said, the words clipped. "They're liquidating everything. It's happening right now, at their house. There's a ledger hidden in the floor safe of the home office. You need to move now, or it's all gone." I ended the call and tossed the phone into a storm drain. It rattled once, then was silent. Back in my home office, I initiated the final protocol. A complex data wipe erased my entire system. I watched the folders, Croft, Vance, Nautilus, vanish into digital oblivion. This wasn't just covering my tracks. It was the demolition of the entire architecture of my revenge. I removed the physical hard drive, took it to the garage, and placed it in a bench vise. I turned the handle. The sound of the plastic cracking was the definitive end. The investigation was over. From my printer, I took a single, freshly printed page. It was a professional invoice. At the bottom was a single, staggering number. I folded it with precision and placed it in the inner pocket of my jacket. It was not evidence. It was a bill. I was in the garden when the shouting started. Night had fallen. I could hear their muffled, angry voices from inside the house, the ugly sounds polluting the calm air. Julian's menacing calm, then Isabella's frantic denials. "I don't know what that is. I would never." His roar of rage was primal. "Don't lie to me." The sounds of their partnership dissolving. A crash, the expensive vase, I imagined. There was no triumph on my face, only a profound, weary sadness. I reached out and touched the soft petal of a perfect white rose. Then my fingers slid down the stem. I closed my hand deliberately around a sharp thorn. The wince was real, a quiet penance for a necessary wound. Then came the sirens. They pierced the night, growing rapidly louder, drowning out their pathetic, private war. A thunderous knock echoed through the house. FBI, open the door. The breach was swift, professional, and brutal. I watched from the shadows of the hallway as they flooded the living room. Red and blue lights strobed through the windows, casting the chaotic scene in a hellish glow. Julian and Isabella were separated, their faces pale with shock. His disbelief, her stunned, weeping face. Their empire of lies, built on the suffering of others, crumbled in seconds. An agent led Isabella, her wrists in handcuffs, through the wreckage of her life. The life she had killed her soul for was over. As the agent moved her toward the front door, she saw me. I was standing calmly in the foyer, a detached observer in my own home. I wore a simple jacket. Her mind, reeling from the implosion, couldn't place me. The dull, safe, clueless man. How? She whispered, the question a desperate, bewildered plea. How could you know any of this? I met her gaze. My eyes were not filled with the hatred of a scorned husband. They were filled with the cold, weary disappointment of a judge delivering a final verdict. This was never about your affair, Isabella, I said, my voice quiet, cutting through the chaos. It was about your recklessness. I took a step closer. The lead FBI agent paused, listening. My paltry paycheck wasn't for cashmere sweaters. It was a shield. For years, my real work has been finding people like Julian, unraveling their schemes. I am the man they have nightmares about. I let the words hang in the air. They call me the ledger. The agent's eyes widened with a sudden, dawning recognition. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the folded invoice. I handed it not to my wife, but to him. My fee, I said simply. I turned my gaze back to Isabella. Her face had crumpled, the impossible, world-altering truth landing like a physical blow. The people I hunt are monsters. I built this life, this fortress of quiet normalcy, to keep you safe from them. And you unlocked the gate and invited one in to share our bed. My revenge isn't that you're going to prison. I delivered the final line as they pulled her out the door into the flashing lights. It's that you'll spend the rest of your life understanding how much you had to lose.